अष्टोत्तरशत श्री श्रीमद् अभय चरणारविंद भक्ति वेदांत जगद्गुरु श्रील प्रभुपाद की जय। इस्कॉन फाउंडर आचार्य बीबीटी फाउंडर आचार्य जगद्गुरु श्रील प्रभुपाद की जय। जय ओम विष्णुपाद परमहंस परिव्राजकाचार्य अष्टोत्तरशत श्री श्रीमद् भक्ति सिद्धांत सरस्वती गोस्वामी महाराज श्रील प्रभुपाद की जय। अनंत कोटि वैष्णव वृंद की जय। नामाचार्य श्रील हरिदास ठाकुर की जय। प्रेम से कहो श्री कृष्ण चैतन्य प्रभु नित्यानंद श्री अद्वैत गदाधर श्रीवासादि गौर भक्त वृंद की जय। श्री श्री राधा कृष्ण गोप गोपीनाथ श्याम कुंड राधा कुंड गिरि गोवर्धन की जय। ग्रंथराज श्रीमद् भागवतम की जय। निताय गौर प्रेमानंदे हरि हरि। All glories to the assembled devotees, all glories to the assembled devotees, all glories to the assembled devotees, all glories, all glories, all glories to Shri Shri Guru and Shri Gauranga, all glories to Jagat Guru Srila Prabhupada. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Narayanam Namaskritya Naram Chaiva Narottamam Devim Saraswatim Vyasam Tato Jaya Mudiraye Nashtaprayeshu Abhadreshu Nityam Bhagavata Sevaya Bhagavatyuttama Shloke Bhaktir Bhavati Naisthiki Krishnaya Vasudevaya Devaki Nandanaya Cha Nanda Gopakumaraya Govindaya Namo Namaha. A reading from Srimad Bhagavatam. It's canto number 3, chapter number 6, creation of the universal form. Text number 6. 7. Text number 7. Please repeat after me. Sa Vai Vishwasrujam Garbho Deva Karmatma Shaktiman Vibhajatmanatmanam Ekadha Dashadha Tridha Savai Vishwasrujam Garbho Deva Karmatma Shaktiman Vidbhajatmanatmanam Ekadha Dashadha Tridha Savai Vishwasrujam Garbho Deva Karmatma Shaktiman Vibhajatmanatmanam Ekada Dashadha Tridha Savai Vishwasrujam Garbho Deva Karmatma Shaktiman Vibhajatmanatmanam Ekadha Dashadha Tridha. Please repeat, please chant. Savai Vishwasrujam Garbho Deva Karmatma Shaktiman Atman Ekadha Tridha Savai Vishwasrujam Garbho देवकर्मात्मशक्तिमान् विबभाजात्मनात्मानम् एकधा दशधा त्रिधा स वै विश्वसृजां गर्भो विभाजात्मनात्मानम् एकधा दशधा त्रिधा स वै विश्वसृजां गर्भो एव कर्मात्मशक्तिमान् विबभाजात्मनात्मानम् एकधा दशधा त्रिधा स वै विश्वसृजां गर्भो देवकर्मात्मशक्तिमान् विबभाजात्मनात्मानम् एकधा दशधा त्रिधा माताजी स वै विश्वसृजां गर्भो शक्तिमान् विभाजात्मनात्मानम् एकधा दशधा त्रिधा स वै विश्वसृजां गर्भो देवकर्मात्मशक्तिमान् भाजात्मनात्मानम् एकधा दशधा त्रिधा सह that why certainly Vishwasrujam of the gigantic Virat form, Garbha total energy, Deva living energy, Karma activity of life, Atma self, Shaktiman full with potencies, Vibhabhaja divided, Atmana by himself, Atmanam himself, Ekadha in oneness, Dashadha in 10, Tridha and in 3. Translation and purport by Abhay Charnaravind Bhaktivedanta Swami Jagadguru Srila Prabhupada Ki Jai. The translation: the total energy of the Mahat Tattva in the form of the gigantic Virat Rupa divided himself by himself into the consciousness of the living entities, the life of activity and self-identification, which are subdivided into 1, 10 and 3 respectively. Srila Prabhupada's purport: consciousness is the sign of the living entity or the soul. The existence of the soul is manifest in the form of consciousness called Jnana Shakti. The total consciousness is that of the gigantic Virat Rupa, and the same consciousness is exhibited in individual persons. The activity of consciousness is performed through the air of life, which is of 10 divisions. The airs of life are called Prana, Apana, Udana, Vyana and Saman, and are also differently qualified as Naga, Kurma, Krikara, Devadatta and Dhananjaya. The consciousness of the soul becomes polluted by the material atmosphere, and thus various activities are exhibited in the false ego of bodily identification. These various activities are described in Bhagavad Gita 2.41 as Bahushakha Yanantasya Buddhyo Avyavasainam. The conditioned soul is bewildered into various activities for want of pure consciousness. In pure consciousness, the activity is one. The consciousness of the individual soul becomes one with the supreme consciousness when there is complete synthesis between the two. The monist believes that there is only one consciousness, whereas the sattvatas or the devotees believe that although there is undoubtedly one consciousness, they are one because there is an agreement. The individual consciousness is advised to dovetail with the supreme consciousness as instructed by the Lord in Bhagavad Gita 1866. Sarvadharman parityajya mam ekam sharanam vraja. The individual consciousness, Arjuna, is advised to dovetail with the supreme consciousness and thus maintain his conscious purity. It is foolish to try to stop the activities of consciousness, but they can be purified when they are dovetailed with the supreme. This consciousness is divided into three modes of self-identification according to the proportion of purity. Adhyatmika or self-identification with the body and mind. Adhibhautika or self-identification with the material products. And Adidaivika or self-identification as a servant of the Lord. Of the three, Adidaivika, self-identification, is the beginning of purity of consciousness in pursuance of the desire of the Lord. Vandeham Shri Guru Shri Yuta Padakamalam Shri Gurun Vaishnavamscha Shri Rupam Sagrajatam Sahagana Raghunathanvitam Tam Sajivam Sadvaitam Savadhutam Parijana Sahitam Krishna Chaitanya Devam Shri Radha Krishna Padan Sahagana Lalita Shri Vishakhanvitamscha Nama Om Vishnupadaya Krishna Presthaya Bhutale Shri Mate Bhakti Vedanta Swami Niti Namine Namaste Saraswati Deve Gauravani Pracharine Nirvishesha Shunyavadi Paschatya Deshatarine Jai Sri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Shri Advaita Gadadhara Shrivasadi Gaura Bhakta Vrinda Hare Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama 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 Hare Hare. Hare Krishna. So we see that in the spiritual world there is spiritual energy of Krishna that is called Bahiranga Shakti or Chit Shakti. And in Chaitanya Charitamrita it is shown how the Chit Shakti is also made up of three components. It's Samvit, meaning all the paraphernalia of Krishna, his abode, his bedding, his seat, or his ornaments, his clothes, and his pastime places. Everything is made up of Sandhini Shakti. There is second component of the spiritual energy that is called Samvit Shakti, which is about the knowledge. That means everyone who is in the spiritual world, in that pure consciousness that Srila Prabhupada is talking about, is aware of Krishna's position, or he is completely aware that Krishna is to be served. God is my master and I am servant of God. Krishna is my master, I am Krishna Das. That is the consciousness in the spiritual world. And that knowledge is always there with every living entity who is part of the Antaranga, internal potency of the Lord. And the third component of the internal potency or Chit Shakti is Lahadini. Lahadini means the pleasure potency of Krishna. So everyone that lives in the spiritual world, they're enthused with that consciousness that I have to work for the pleasure of Krishna. And that's the only consciousness that flows in the spiritual world. How can we please Krishna? How can I serve Krishna better? How can I make Krishna happier? How can I bring little smile on his face? So that's the basic idea in the spiritual world. But just like we see in the material world, sometimes, very pure, a well-trained person, he may fall in love with some untrained and not so well-behaved girl. And he falls in love, and then he thinks of marrying her. And then, because the girl puts the conditions, many times after marriage, they say that now we want everything separate. No living with the parents, no more mama's boy. Now you're my boy, so you have to come with me. And we will have separate everything. Separate kitchen, separate apartment. I want to live separate. So that separation is, in one sense, can be seen as Mahat Tattva. So the living entity who is infatuated by external energy, who allures the living entity with the idea that you can become the enjoyer. Why do you have to serve Krishna? You can actually become the enjoyer. You can become controller. You are not less than Krishna in any sense. So the living entity is captured with the sense of controllership or the false enjoyment tendency. And then there is Mahat Tattva. It's like living separate, away from the real parents or real mother and father. Then the living entity has separate existence. So this is also provided by Krishna. So how Mahat Tattva is created, Krishna in the form of Karano Dakshai Vishnu, Mahavishnu, he is the one who creates all these innumerable universes. And then he expands himself in the form of Ksharo Dakshai Vishnu. And he enters all those universes. Garbho Dakshai Vishnu, he enters all the universes and he creates all the varieties in the world. Different enjoyments are created in the form by Garbho Dakshai Vishnu. And then the same Mahavishnu, he also expands himself as Ksharo Dakshai Vishnu. And he enters into every atom and every living entity in the form of Paramatma. And he is accompanying the living entity as Ksharo Dakshai Vishnu. So he is the one who is moving everything. Now in this verse, we're learning about the total energy of Mahat Tattva in the form of the gigantic Virat Rupa. He has divided himself by himself into the consciousness of the living entities. Now this consciousness of living entities has been described by Jiva Goswami in the Paramatma Sandarbha and also by Baladev Vidyabhushan in the Govinda Bhashya, the commentary on the Vedanta Sutras, and Srila Prabhupada comments in the Chaitanya Charitamrita, takes those references, and he mentions that the material consciousness is the one which covers the pure consciousness of the living entity so that the living entity can enjoy the material world. Otherwise, it's not possible for the living entity, if it is conscious of Krishna always, then it is not possible to enjoy. Because material enjoyment is so third class. It's actually so ridiculous and so worthless that unless by the mercy of Krishna, we forget Krishna and we forget our relationship with Krishna, it is even completely impossible to enjoy the external energy or the so-called enjoyment in Maya. There is as an example, we know Ramanujacharya. He had a cousin brother whose name was Govinda. And he was married. And those days there used to be like child marriages when the boy and the girl, they're young, they would get married, but they would still live with the parents. And it was a good system because the girl would know that I have a husband. So the girl's mind was stable. She would not look for somebody else. And the same with the boy. The boy would focus on his studies instead of being busy on the Instagram, right? So that was a good system. But so in that fashion, Govinda was already married. But then he came in contact with Ramanuja, who was his cousin brother. That's also beautiful pastime that he's actually a disciple of Sri Shaila Purna. And one time Ramanujacharya visited Sri Shaila Purna in Tirupati, and he spent so much time with the Guru, and that time he saw how nicely Govinda is serving his spiritual master. And they developed such a beautiful relationship, Ramanuj and Govinda, that when the time came that Ramanujacharya was about to leave Tirupati, Sri Shaila Purna happily asked, "What can I give you, my dear Ramanujacharya? You have completely pleased me. I want to give you something. What should I give you?" So Ramanuja, he said, "Can you please give me your disciple Govinda? I want him." So that was like, "Oh, you want him? Okay, take him." But this Govinda was heartbroken. So while they were walking back, because those days there were no trains or no flights, so while they were walking back, Govinda stopped eating. He started fasting because he couldn't bear the separation from his guru. And then finally Ramanuja understood that maybe I made a mistake. What am I doing? I'm separating the two, inseparable, the disciple and the great guru. What am I doing? So he said, "You go back. It's okay, you go back." And then Govinda became so happy that, okay, now I'm relieved. I can go back and serve my spiritual master the same way I used to. So he started running to the Tirupati, miles and miles. Actually, he traveled like 300 or 400 miles running without eating, without drinking anything, because he was fasting because of separation from Guru. But when he came, Sri Shaila Purna was being served by his wife. And the wife became so happy. "Look, Govinda is back." But Sri Shaila Purna, he said, "Tell him that when a cow is given in donation, then it's not taken back." So that time Govinda, he understood that now I can please my spiritual master only by serving Ramanuja. So he went back again. So that's the level of these great devotees we see. Then he was only serving his guru in this mode of separation. He was serving him by serving Ramanujacharya. So, but he was married, so his family members came and he said that now, he only lives with you, but he is married, he has to come home and at least do his duties as Grihastha. So Ramanuja said, "Govinda, you should go home, spend some time with your wife, do your duties, and come back." So he said, "Okay, as you please." So he went, he spent a month, and he came back. So Ramanuja Acharya asked, "So everything well, everything good, you did your duties, everything is fine?" He said, "Everything perfect. I'm back now in your service." But then again the family members of Govinda came complaining to Ramanujacharya that, it's been so many months, he hasn't come back, and we want children, we want grandchildren. But he doesn't come, he only lives with you. That time Ramanuja said, "Spend good proper amount of time with your wife. You have to do your duties as Grihastha, and then you come back." So he went again. And after spending some time, he came back. That time Ramanujacharya asked, "So, did you spend time with your wife?" He said, "Yes." "So tell me in details what all you did. What was your activities? What did you do in daytime?" So he said, "In the daytime, I would tell her about the pastimes of Lord Ramachandra in Ayodhya. And in the night time, I would tell her the pastimes of Lord Ramachandra when he was in the forest, in the exile." Then Ramanujacharya was, "But you have to perform your duties. You have to beget children. Otherwise, your parents are again going to come and complain to me. So Ramanujacharya was chastising. But then he said, Govinda said, that my dear Ramanuja, whenever I even think of doing anything physical with my wife, I always remember that Lord is in my heart, and I always think of only Rama, only Ramachandra. That's all I think, Ram and Sita, and I always remember you. So there is not possibility for me. Actually, I am not meant for Grihastha life. I cannot do this. So that time Ramanujacharya understood that there is no point telling him, because he's actually meant for sannyas life. So he gave sannyas to Govinda. So the living entity we see here cannot enjoy the material activities or sense gratification unless it is put into the illusion. So the material consciousness covers the living entity, and according to the body, the living entity makes the definitions of enjoyment. That's called chitta vritti. Otherwise, the stool that is abominable in the body of a human being, the same stool becomes the delicacy when the same living entity travels from human body to a hog's body. How it is possible? The same material substance which is abominable in one body becomes like a delicacy in another body. How it is possible? It happens because of chitta vritti. So this material consciousness covers the living entity into thinking that I am my body. And everything that is related to my body is actually my extended self. And he completely forgets that he is servant of Krishna. So that's what Srila Prabhupada here mentions. The conditioned soul is bewildered into various activities for want of pure consciousness. In pure consciousness, the activity is one. That is Krishna consciousness. And now the consciousness has been polluted by the material atmosphere. The living entity becomes engaged in the so-called sinful activities or the so-called sense gratificatory activities. And those activities are performed by karma. The activity happens by 10 types of airs that are mentioned here. So there is prana, apana, udana, vyana, samana. So these all you can find in Ayurveda if someone is more interested in these. These airs actually make us move, because earth is the grossest element in the material world. Then the subtler is the liquids or water, and then the subtler, then the fire, then air, ether. But without air, nothing can function. Even if you're sitting still in meditation and you are thinking you're not doing anything, but still, even if there is one thought that comes in your brain, that means there are some brain cells that are working, and that can happen only because of some air that is making that happen. So for example, prana is prana vayu, that actually deals with the chest and the head, the brain functionality. There is apana is for the downward motion, like pelvis tissues and all. Udana also has functionality about circulation. There is vyana that is about nervous system. So this is all scientific. And there is samana. So all these vayus, when they move, the activities happen. And that's in the Ayurveda. So if you want to learn more. But Srila Prabhupada brings back the most important topic about how the consciousness, the self-consciousness is polluted in the material world, and the living entity is on the platform of Adhyatmika. means only concerned about my body and whatever is concerned with the body, my wife, my children, my friends, my relatives, this is my sphere of influence. And that's the self-identification in the form of adhyatmika, or self-identification with the body and mind. The extended self is adi bhautika, or self-identification with the material products. My phone or my car, my bungalow, so all these different extended self. And adi daivika basically is the beginning of spiritual life. From adhyatmika and from adi bhautika, if someone wants to begin to think about the real identification, the real self, if someone wants to go into adi daivika stage, then Srila Prabhupada mentions it is very important to understand the intricacies of how the world is created and how it is maintained and destroyed by Supreme Personality of Godhead. And from there, one can understand what is my real identity and what is my real goal. And that can happen only when someone is connected with a Tattva Darshan Guru. Only a spiritual master can describe the details about the material elements, their workings, their dealings with each other. And from there, we can understand how this material world is so insignificant. It's ultimately only made up of earth, water, fire, air, ether. That's only different combinations of these elements. So one time, there was Miss Mexico who came to visit the temple in the Srila Prabhupada's time. And devotees were awestruck. They were like, wow, that's Miss Mexico. Que bonita, que bonita. They were like, oh, so beautiful. Look at her, she's so beautiful. And Prabhupada could see that the mood in the temple has changed. And everybody was looking towards her than looking at the beautiful deities. And Srila Prabhupada could see. And then some devotees came running to Prabhupada, saying that, Srila Prabhupada, Miss Mexico is here in the temple. Should we bring her to you? Srila Prabhupada said, yes, you can bring her, but also remember that when she passes stool, that is also very stinky. So devotees didn't understand, and they were like, what does that mean? And then the bubble and the illusion of the material attraction. Oh, Miss Mexico is here, she's so beautiful, everybody is only attracted to her, looking at her. That bubble was broken by Srila Prabhupada. And then devotees understood that, okay, she is beautiful, but ultimately it's just combination of different elements of the material world. It's just better packaging. Sometimes, the same thing is packaged in a different way. They look beautiful. Or a woman is attracted to the man thinking, oh, he's so muscular, so beautiful. But ultimately, it's only earth, water, fire, air, ether. And why are we thinking about it in so much of molecular level? Why, Bhagavatam is describing at such a molecular level, because Bhagavatam is being spoken to Parikshit Maharaj, and who is about to leave the world. He is about to die in only 7 days. Why such a person is being told all these, earth, water, fire, air, ether, and how the material elements at a molecular level? Because in some sense, at the back of our mind, even though we hear so much about spirituality, and we hear so much about, pastimes of Krishna. Oh, Krishna stole the butter of the living, like the gopis. And Krishna, he grabbed one gopi like this. And then Mother Yashoda grabbed Krishna. We hear so many beautiful pastimes. How Krishna played with his cowherd friends. But somehow at the back of our mind, we're thinking that I am still happy in this world. We still have a romantic connection to this material world, which is broken only when we understand how the material elements are ultimately nothing, is the same basic elements in different combinations. So that's what Srila Prabhupada always did, to break that romantic connection that sometimes a living entity gets attracted to so-called material elements, material objects. So one time Srila Prabhupada, when he was arriving at the airport, and he came down from the stairs, and there was like a big group of devotees. They were ready to welcome Srila Prabhupada. There was nice kirtan going on. And Srila Prabhupada came, and he was walking towards one of the disciples. But that time, the same time, how it's funny how even Krishna tests. At the same exact time, there was one air hostess who was very nicely dressed, and we know how air hostesses are really beautiful, and they also dress very nicely, they carry themselves so nicely. One air hostess was walking by, and the devotee who was holding the garland just to offer to Prabhupada, he started looking at that air hostess. And he completely followed her. His eyes were following her all the way until she went. And when he was done, when she left, then he looked, Prabhupada was right in front of his face. And Srila Prabhupada was smiling. But the disciple, he felt so ashamed that, I caught red-handed in front of Guru, and now he was ready that I'm going to be chastised. Srila Prabhupada, on the contrary, said, "Isn't she beautiful?" And the disciple was so confused, thinking, if I say yes, that means I agree, and that means I was completely watching and I was mesmerized by her beauty. But if I say no, that means I am disagreeing to the spiritual master. So he just decided to keep mum. He didn't say a single word. He just was ashamed and looking down. But Srila Prabhupada said, just think, if creation is that beautiful, the creator who creates all these beautiful things in the world, how much more beautiful that creator must be. How much more beautiful Krishna must be. So Srila Prabhupada brought the attention, the mesmerization that a living entity is constantly thinking about the material objects and constantly attracted to the material things. He brought it back to Krishna. Because our real attention must be on Krishna. How beautiful Krishna is, how beautiful Radha and Krishna, their pastimes are, and how can we serve them. So that's the real goal of life. And that's something done by the spiritual master. The spiritual master brings the consciousness of the disciple from being on the Adi Bhautika stage, from Adhyatmic stage to Adi Daivika stage. The spiritual master, sometimes he's called Karnadhar. He sometimes pulls and twists the ear of the disciple and brings the attention back to spirituality, because that's the real home of the living entity, and that's where the real goal of the living entity, to go back to the spiritual world. So the goal of every living entity, every disciple, is to understand these topics about how the material world works, to serve the spiritual master in such a way that his consciousness is purified and dovetailed back to the supreme consciousness. The Srila Prabhupada ki jai. So we will stop here. If anybody has questions. You have a question, Maharaj? Do you have a question? I cannot answer you. I'm too small to answer you, Maharaj.
question is the question that many people have, and you mentioned, sorry, going back to the spiritual world is the ideal, is the goal. But one may ask why? Why should I want to go there when I'm here? I can enjoy here. I have enjoyment in the spiritual world. What is the difference? And if you know, please tell us, and if you don't, I will.
What is the difference between?
The joy of the spiritual world and the joy of the material world. They're the same word, but they manifest differently. So would you like to tell us the difference?
The happiness in the spiritual world is eternal. That's why it's the spiritual world is described as Sat, Chit, and Ananda. That Ananda is eternal happiness, meaning that when a living entity gets little happiness in the spiritual world, that stays with that living entity for eternity. In the material world, our happiness is very transient. It's momentary. It's very temporary. If you eat what you like, you feel good, but then you want to eat more. Because why? Because the happiness is already gone. Because now you want more happiness, so you want to eat more. So you eat more, and then you want to eat more. And then when you want to eat more, then your stomach is paining. So in the material world, happiness does not come alone. Happiness always brings his friend, that is distress. Happiness and distress, they come together, but we don't perceive them together. First, we only perceive happiness, and then distress comes automatically. And that is true for every single material happiness that we achieve in the material world. Not just things. If you enjoy some things, you get attached to them, and the things don't last forever. For example, if you get attached to your phone, it's not going to last forever. Maybe 2 years, 3 years, and then there is a big crack on the screen, right? There is a big crack on the screen, and then there is a big crack on your heart, because it hurts you, because you're so attached. You have a scratch on your heart too. The same, you're attached to your Mercedes-Benz. One day there is a scratch on the Mercedes-Benz, and you feel it at your heart, like as if somebody stabbed you. So happiness and distress, they come together in the material world. They're the two sides of the same coin. And third aspect, I would say, even for the relationships, if you become attached to a person, the person's body, the body is going to change. If you see over the time, the person is not going to be the same beautiful. And even if you have a perfect life with your partner, if you think that my wife is the best, the wife thinks my husband is the best, even if so-called perfection in the material world is very short-lived, because over a period of time, death is going to attack one of them, and to the extent you are attached, to that extent it's going to come back at you. To the extent you are attached to a material person, to the same extent it's going to hurt you at some point. So ultimately, material happiness is also called disguised happiness. It's like a robber coming to you to rob you, but with a big smile and pretending to be your friend. So that's why we have to be very careful of that robber, and we should not let it rob us.
So what you're saying, are you finished?
Yes.
Okay, so what you're saying is that the difference between happiness in the spiritual world and happiness in the material world is that in the spiritual world, it is eternal, non-stop, ever even growing and intensifying, and it's always there, and you don't have to worry about it disappearing. Whereas in the material world, if you have some nice ice cream and you keep licking it, eventually it's not gone, it's gone. And when it's gone, then you're miserable because you want that happiness to continue. Is that the idea? And therefore, that's the difference. You have misery accompanying your so-called happiness in the material world. In the spiritual world, there is no such misery. There is only ever-increasing, intense bliss. Thank you very much.
Jai
It was a
Maharaj.
very nice explanation.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
शिल प्रभुपाद की जय, ग्रंथराज श्रीमद् भागवतम की जय, जिताय गौर प्रेमानंदे हरि 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 बोल।
Jai, great answer. Wonderful.